lecture, we are going to understand how our NCERT module is rolled out. I am going to take up one lecture, that is one chapter from NCERT class 8. Let me share my screen with you guys. All right, students. So the chapter that we are going to discuss today in today's lecture is based on the class 8's history of NCERT, and the book's name is Our Past 3 Part 2. Now, students, this corresponds to the 7th chapter of your class 8's NCERT, and the chapter's name is Weavers, Iron Smelters, and Factory Owners. So this is the cover title, cover page of your book, and the chapter looks something like this. Now, students, in this particular lecture, not only I'm going to take you through this particular chapter, I'm also going to tell you my teaching strategy when it comes to NCERTs and how they are going to be helpful for you guys for your next UPSC examination. Now, students, whenever, if you are enrolling for this NCERT course, let me tell you that in your history section particularly, I am going to start with each and every chapter wherein I am going to take up the entire text of the NCERT, because the idea for me and for you guys is to not go back to the NCERTs. These videos will be sufficient for you. Also, students, I will be also taking up all the important images that are presented in the NCERT along with the text which is mentioned as a part of these, because sometimes there is good information as a part of these images. So these will also be incorporated in our videos. Apart from the students, at the beginning of every video, I am going to define all the key topics that are given here that are a part of your chapter so that you can understand how the chapter is going to move forward. And students, in the end, I am going to give you 2 MCQs which are based on the chapter so that you can understand how UPSC makes questions from NCERTs. So by far, this is going to be the methodology through which we are going to conduct our NCERT lectures. You need not go through your NCERTs. The videos in itself will be very, very sufficient. Now, students, let's start with the lecture. So as I've already told you, this is the 7th chapter of your NCERT class 8, and the chapter's name is Weavers, Iron Smelters, and Factory Owners. Now, the name itself is telling you a lot about this chapter. In this particular chapter, students, we are going to talk about 2 industries, that is the weaving industry and the iron and steel industry. And then, students, we are going to understand that how gradually these weaving and iron and steel industries developed in our country, and as a part, factories came up. तो ये नाम से ही हमने डिफरेंशिएट कर लिया कि इस चैप्टर के अंदर वीविंग टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री के बारे में पढ़ेंगे, आयरन और स्टील इंडस्ट्री के बारे में पढ़ेंगे, ब्रिटिशर्स के आने से पहले क्या था, ब्रिटिशर्स के टाइम क्या था, और आगे कैसे डेवलपमेंट हुआ, कैसे फैक्ट्रीज बनी इन पर्टिकुलर इंडस्ट्रीज के अंदर. अब हम अपने टॉपिक्स सॉर्ट कर लेते हैं. टॉपिक्स क्या इंपॉर्टेंट है इस चैप्टर के अंदर. सो स्टूडेंट्स, इन द इनिशियल पार्ट ऑफ दिस चैप्टर वी आर गोइंग टू बी इंट्रोड्यूस्ड with the textile trade in India before the advent of British. That is what the textile industry was like before the coming of these European powers in our country, particularly the British. Also, students, we are going to understand that what were the types of textiles that were produced in our country, which were famous throughout the world. Then, students, we are going to understand the importance of the weavers community and the techniques that were used by these weavers in creating the amazing handicrafts that our country has. Then, students, we are going to talk about the impact of the technological innovations in Britain, that how they impacted the handicraft industry of our country. Also, students, of prominence is a Calico Act, which is given in your chapter. We are going to also talk about this. Then, students, we are going to talk about the decline of textile industry in India after the coming of British, and finally the revival of textiles in India, particularly after the First World War. So, students, this sums up the first part of your chapter. Till here, we are going to talk about the textiles. Then, students, starts the second part or the next part of this chapter, which is pertaining to the iron and steel industries in our country. So basically, we will start by understanding the processes of iron and steel making in India. And our focus in this chapter is going to be on one unique kind of steel, that is the wood steel. Then students, we are going to understand that what were the factors that led to decline in iron and steel production after the coming of British. So you can see that the trajectory in both of these industries is almost similar. That is, after coming of Britishers, both the textile and the steel industry sort of declined. However, like the handicraft industry, there was also a revival in the iron and steel industries, which we are going to talk about. So students, this fairly sums up the entire contents of your chapter, and this is how we are going to navigate further. So chalo shuru karte hain. Now students, first we are going to talk about the Indian textiles, how the Indian textiles were, what was their condition before the advent of European trading companies in our country, particularly the British. Now students, you must know that India by far was the world's largest producer of cotton textiles. Cotton textiles के लिए हम बहुत ज़्यादा famous थे. और कौन सी जगह हमारी कॉटन टेक्सटाइल्स ट्रेड होती थी? दे वर एक्सटेंसिवली ट्रेडेड इन साउथ ईस्ट एशिया, पर्टिकुलरली इन एरियाज ऑफ जावा, सुमात्रा एंड पेनांग. Apart from Southeast Asia, students, our textiles were also traded in the western and central parts of Asia. Herein, students, it will be important to note that India also had a very good market with respect to Europe and Africa. So not only it was Asia, we were trading in other continents as well. This was the extent of trade with respect to textile industry of our country. Now students, European traders had first encountered the fine cotton cloth from India, which was carried by the Arab merchants in Mosul in present day Iraq. अब स्टूडेंट्स क्या है, जो हमारी कंट्री की टेक्सटाइल है उसको अलग अलग कंट्रीज में अलग अलग नामों से जाना जाता है, पर्टिकुलरली यूरोप में. And the reason for this is because the Europeans did not encounter the textiles from our country directly. Rather, they got hold of our textiles from other countries, particularly the Arab merchants. And that is why they gave the textiles of India the name of muslin. So here in students, the origin of the term muslin is important. You have to remember these 2 points. So this till now, I hope you have understood all these points. Now students, we are going to move to the next slide. Now I'm going to tell you about the advent of other European companies and what impact did it have on the textile industry of our country. So students, as we all know, the Portuguese were the first European traders who had come to India, and they had come in the search of spices. As you all know, and even if you don't know, our country was very famous for its spices, that is particularly the black pepper, etc. And that is why all of the European countries wanted to get hold of the spice trade. And that is why they were looking for different trade routes in order to reach to India. Among them, the Portuguese were the first one who had landed in Calicut, which lies on the west coast of Kerala. Apart from the students, the cotton textiles, which they took back to Europe along with the spices, came to be known as calico, and subsequently calico became the general name for all cotton textiles. तो स्टूडेंट्स, हमने पिछली स्लाइड में और इस स्लाइड में 2 इंपॉर्टेंट बातें पढ़ी हैं. एक टर्म है मसलिन और दूसरी टर्म है कैलिको. कैलिको नाम कॉटन टेक्सटाइल्स को पोर्चुगीज ने दिया और मसलिन नाम अरब ट्रेडर्स उनको मसलिन बुलाते थे, इसलिए यूरोपियंस भी उनको मसलिन बुलाने लग गए. तो हमें इन दोनों टर्म्स क्या हैं, ये किस वर्ड को कॉरेस्पॉन्ड करती हैं और इनकी क्या ओरिजिन्स है, all these 3 points for us are important. Apart from the students, one very important fact here is that around 98 varieties of cotton and silk cloth were available in India. So you can see how different varieties, how extant the trade was prevalent in our country with respect to the textile industry. अब students, यहाँ पर मैंने एक image ली है, ये आपकी NCERT में भी दी हुई है. इसके अंदर आपको एक पर्टिकुलर वीव के बारे में बताया हुआ है. द नेम ऑफ द वीव इज पटोला वीव एंड दिस वाज अ पार्ट ऑफ द मिड 19th century. Now students, a very important and crisp information regarding to patola weave is given here, and it says that patola was woven in Surat, Ahmedabad and Patan, and it was highly valued in Indonesia, and it also became a part of the local weaving tradition there. तो अगर आप देखेंगे तो ये पॉइंट आपके लिए एंशिएंट इंडियन मॉडर्न इंडियन हिस्ट्री के पर्सपेक्टिव से भी इंपॉर्टेंट है, ट्रेडिंग साइड से, और आर्ट एंड कल्चर से भी इंपॉर्टेंट है, क्योंकि टेक्सटाइल के ऊपर क्वेश्चन पूछे जाते हैं। तो इसीलिए ये जो इमेजेस भी हमारे को एनसीईआरटी में छोटी छोटी दी हुई होती हैं, दीज आर वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, डू रीड देम, डू रीड देयर डिस्क्रिप्शन. Now let's move on, students. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. Before moving on to the next slide, I would like to show you the trade route that was used by the Portuguese to reach to India. This is important for us. So students, basically the Portuguese had started from here, and by traveling across the continent of Africa, wherein they had first reached to Cape of Good Hope, then they had finally come to Calicut, and therein they had got hold of the spices and the cotton textiles. So this trajectory, particularly the Cape of Good Hope, is important because it was the midpoint. Okay. Now let's move on to the next slide. Right now, in the last slide, I had told you that as many as 98 varieties of textiles were a part of the Indian textile industry. Now, among them, we are going to talk about those varieties which were commercially important both in the domestic and in the international market. Now, students, herein, the in-demand varieties included printed cotton clothes, which were known as chints, coasses or khassa, and bandana. Now, herein, students, we are going to understand that what does the terms chints and bandana entail. So, the term chints is derived from the Hindi word chint, and it is a cloth with small and colorful flowery designs. आज भी अगर आप देखेंगे तो जो भी ज्यादातर इंडिया के अंदर सूट्स बनते हैं, उनके कॉटन के जो सूट होते हैं उनके ऊपर फ्लावर के बड़े ब्यूटीफुल प्रिंट्स होते हैं. तो उस प्रिंट को, उस फ्लावर प्रिंट को जो कॉटन पे होता था, उसको चिंट्स बोलते थे. और ये इंडिया में ही नहीं, ये यूरोपियन मार्केट में भी बहुत ज्यादा डिमांड में था. Now students, the next important textile is bandana. बैंडाना हम सबने सुना है, बैंडाना जो हम सर पे बांधते हैं उसको बैंडाना बोलते हैं, लेकिन इसका जो ओरिजिन था वो अलग था. बेसिकली इट इज डिराइव्ड फ्रॉम द हिंदी वर्ड दैट इज बांधना, एंड इट इज रेफर्ड टू अ वैरायटी ऑफ ब्राइटली कलर्ड cloth that are produced through a method of tying and dyeing. तो टाई एंड डाई कंटेम्पररी टाइम्स में भी बहुत फेमस है. टाई एंड डाई का प्रोसेस आज भी इंडिया में कपड़े बनाने में यूज किया जाता है, और इसी का पार्ट ये बैंडाना होता है. और बैंडाना और चिंट्स दोनों एक ऐसी वैरायटी थी टेक्सटाइल की जो कि यूरोपियन मार्केट के अंदर बहुत ज्यादा फेमस थी. बैंडाना के ऊपर कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट इंफॉर्मेशन आपको इस पर्टिकुलर इमेज में भी दी हुई है, wherein it has been told that in this particular odhni that is given in the image, you can see that there are two tie and dye silk pieces which are seamed together with gold thread and embroidery. So this is the process. This is not that much important. Important for us is these two lines, that is, bandana patterns were mostly produced in Rajasthan and Gujarat. So again, students, from the art and culture perspective, this particular point is important. You need to know that where this bandana is particularly made in India, and that is in the states of Rajasthan and Gujarat. Now let's move on to the next slide. Till now, students, we have understood that what was the textile industry of India like before the coming of the Europeans in our country, what were the varieties that were produced, and what were the important varieties that were a part of the international trade. Now, students, we are going to talk about the people who were making these textiles, that is the weavers. Now, students, the weavers belong to the communities who were specializing in weaving, and the skills were passed to them from one generation to the next. अब अपनी कंट्री में क्या होता था स्टूडेंट्स, एक मेथड था, एक मेथड काफी लंबे समय तक चला था कि जो फादर का प्रोफेशन है वो ही प्रोफेशन आगे उनका बेटा, फिर उनका बेटा, फिर उनका बेटा फॉरवर्ड लेके जाता रहेगा. तो अपने प्रोफेशन से डिविएट नहीं करते थे लोग. एंड दैट इज व्हाई पर्टिकुलरली इन द टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री दिस मेथड ऑफ passing the skills from one generation to another led to the beautiful advancement in the textile industry, and that is why the weavers were up to the mark, and the international standards of our textiles were very, very high. Now, students, herein in your chapter, some important names of the weaving communities and the areas in which they were dominant are given. Under that, students, the important ones are the Tanti weavers who belong to Bengal. Then there were Julahas or Momin weavers belonging to North India. And then there were Sale and Kaikolar and Devangs belonging to South India. So there are 3 or 4 names of the communities given and the areas in which they were dominant. So you have to make a short list and remember the names and the areas of these people. Okay. Apart from the students, an important map is also presented in this particular chapter, wherein it is titled that where were the major centers of weaving in the late 18th century. Late 18th century corresponds to the 1780s, 1790s period, wherein Mughal Empire was sort of a centralized power in India and Europeans were not a part of our country's dominance. And in the late 18th century, all these parts which are marked were prominent centers of textile industry. You can navigate through the map via this particular box, wherein it is suggesting that what particular symbol is corresponding to what particular textile. Such kind of maps, the information on the images, the descriptions or definitions given in the boxes are something that UPSC is right now looking upon and making questions out of that. That is why the NCERTs are important. Our approach to NCERT should be very dynamic. Now let's move on to the next slide, students. Right now we had understood that who were the weavers, what were the important communities that were a part of our country during the late 18th century. And now, students, we are going to talk about the process of weaving in our country. So students, process of weaving involves spinning, which was the first stage of production. Spinning माने धागे को घुमाना, ऐसे घुमाना, ठीक है, जिसके लिए आप ये पर्टिकुलर इमेज में देखेंगे तो ये स्पिन करने के लिए होता है, यहाँ पर ही धागा घूम रहा है, ठीक है. So this is the first stage of production is spinning, and this particular spinning is mostly done by women. Now you might ignore this when you're reading your chapter, but these kind of points are very, very important because sometimes you get questions like spinning traditionally in our country has mostly been done by men. Now you did not focus on this particular line, but you have to focus because what was the role of man and what was the role of women in any particular industry is something that is of importance with respect to the preliminary perspective. Okay. Now, students, we are going to talk about the instruments that were important while weaving any particular textile. So, students, under that, the spinning instruments included the charkha and the takli, and an example is given over here. Okay. Charkha, as we all know, charkha is something which was made very famous by Gandhiji. So it's a charkha, it's a wooden charkha wherein the thread is being spinned upon. So that is charkha. And then there is another spinning instrument that is takli, which were used by the Indians before coming of the Europeans. Then students, once the spinning is done, then the cloth is woven by the weaver. Okay. So right now I have told you that the process of weaving involves two stages. One is spinning and one is weaving. Spinning is done by women and weaving is done by men. Okay. So you have to remember this distinction that at what stage which gender is more important. Now students, after weaving, you have to always make your cloth a little bit designable, little bit fashionable. So for that, two instruments were used and the names are given in your textbook as well. And the names include rangrez. Now, what is rangrez? Rangrez is basically used as a dyer for dyeing the threads. Okay, so it gives colors to the threads and that is why it is known as rangrez, and it is done on the final cloth. Then students, for the printed cloths, the weavers needed block printers, that is the chip piggers. So another important instrument is chip pigger. You have seen block printing wherein you have this particular mold and then you put certain kind of paint and then you just block it on the cloth. So this block printer is known as chip pigger, and these are the two instruments that are used to beautify the cloth. तो हमने यहाँ पे चार इंस्ट्रूमेंट पढ़ लिए, चरखा, टकली जो कि स्पिनिंग में यूज आते हैं, रंगरेज और चिपिगर जो कि क्लॉथ को ब्यूटिफाई करने में, उसमें मोटिव्स बनाने में काम आते हैं. Now students, let's move on to the next slide. Till now we have understood that what was the condition of India's textile market and what was the weaving community like along with their techniques. Now students, we are going to introduce the European powers into this scenario and what was their impact on the textile industry of our country. So students, herein you must know that by the early 18th century, the wool and silk makers in England had started protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles due to its popularity. Also students, as a part of this, in 1720, the British government had enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles, that is chintz, in England, and this particular act came to be known as the Calico Act. Now, I had told you that there is this one very important point that is given in your chapter, which is pertaining to the Calico Act. कैलिको टर्म क्या थी? पोर्चुगीज से आई थी, इन्होंने कॉटन टेक्सटाइल्स को नाम दिया था। चिंट्स क्या है? चिंट्स के बारे में हमने अभी पीछे पढ़ा है कि एक बहुत ही फेमस टेक्सटाइल थी इंडिया की, जिसका बहुत ही बड़ा इंटरनेशनल मार्केट था। अब प्रॉब्लम स्टूडेंट्स ये हुई कि जो इंग्लैंड के वीवर्स थे, दे डिड नॉट लाइक द फैक्ट दैट व्हाई इन आवर कंट्री एवरीबडी इज बाइंग द इंडियन टेक्सटाइल्स, व्हाई आर दे नॉट बाइंग आवर टेक्सटाइल्स, and that is why they urged the government to ban the cotton textiles that were imported from India altogether. And the British government responded to it by imposing the Calico Act in 1720, wherein the printed cotton textiles, particularly the chintz that were coming from India to England, were banned. Apart from the students, the industry was to grow under the England's government protection was the calico printing industry. So basically, students, this particular point is telling you that the calico printing industry was the first industry wherein government had come forward to give them certain kind of protection in the name of the Calico Act 1720. Also, students, the competition with the Indian textiles had led to search for technological innovation in England. तो ये जो हमारे लिए स्लाइड है, ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट स्लाइड है स्टूडेंट्स। बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट इसलिए है क्योंकि यहाँ पर हमने ये समझा कि इंग्लैंड के लोगों को इंडिया की टेक्सटाइल्स पसंद भी थी, लेकिन ट्रेडर्स को बिल्कुल पसंद नहीं थी क्योंकि उनका खुद का सामान खराब हो रहा था, और इसीलिए कैलिको एक्ट उन्होंने गवर्नमेंट को फोर्स करके लगवाई एंड इंडिया से जो कॉटन क्लॉथ आता था वो बैन हो गया। और इसी वजह से जो कैलिको प्रिंटिंग इंडस्ट्री थी वो फर्स्ट इंडस्ट्री बनी इंग्लैंड में जिसको गवर्नमेंट प्रोटेक्शन मिला। Also, students, because there was a fierce competition with the Indian textiles from England, that is why people in England started making certain technological innovations in order to compete with the fine qualities of textile that were part of India. Now, students, herein in this particular slide, again, I have put forward two examples of two important textiles that were part of India. Now, it is up to you. You are going to read their descriptions. As I've already told you, they are important from modern Indian history perspective. They are also important from art and culture perspective. You know that weaves such as Jamdani have been, I'm sure you have seen such kind of questions in your UPSC examination. So the information which is apt or which is necessary for clearing certain kind of questions is given in your NCERTs as well. Now, students, as I'd already told you that there was search for technological innovations in order to get hold of the market in England as well as in India. There was the certain technological innovations in England included the spinning jenny, which was invented in 1764 by a person known as John Guy. And the idea of this spinning jenny was that it increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. स्पिनिंग जेनी क्या होती है? स्पिनिंग जेनी आपके सामने इस पर्टिकुलर पिक्चर में है। इसने कैसे प्रोडक्टिविटी बढ़ाई ये मैं अभी आपको आगे बताऊंगी। और स्टूडेंट्स, इसके अलावा स्पिनिंग जेनी की एग्जैक्ट डेफिनेशन भी आपकी बुक में दी हुई है। द डेफिनेशन सेज दैट स्पिनिंग जेनी वाज अ मशीन by which single worker could operate several spindles onto thread which was spun, and when the wheel was turned, all the spindles rotated. So basically, students, when there is a traditional spinning machine, therein you can only spin one thread. However, due to the invention of the spinning jenny, on a particular machine itself, various threads could be woven, which ultimately increases the productivity, and the cloth could be made much more quicker and in a cheaper manner. Apart from the spinning jenny, students, another important technological innovation that happened in England during the late 18th century was the invention of steam machine, and this was done by Richard Arkwright in 1786. Now, students, this particular invention revolutionized the cotton textile weaving by producing cheap and immense quantities of cloth. अब ये दोनों जो इनोवेशंस हुए, इन दोनों के साथ ही हम बार बार ये पॉइंट बोल रहे हैं कि इन दोनों के आते ही रेवोल्यूशनाइज हो गया इंग्लैंड के अंदर टेक्सटाइल सेक्टर, बहुत ज्यादा प्रोडक्शन बढ़ गया। कैसे हुआ वो हम इस पर्टिकुलर इमेज के थ्रू समझते हैं। So students, before coming of the spinning jenny, one woman did the spinning using a wheel. So you can see this particular image. There is one single wheel, there is one single thread here, and she is spinning that particular thread. However, students, after the invention of spinning jenny, that is during the Industrial Revolution, Please look at the second image. You can see that one woman is using the spinning jenny and she is doing the work of 16 women. Why? Because this particular wheel is now catering to many threads which are given here, and at the same time many particular threads can be spinned so that the production of cloth is much faster. So one woman can operate as much work as 16 women used to do earlier. Okay, so naturally you understand how the productivity increased. Next, students, was the invention of the steam engine. Now, how does the invention of steam engine impact the textile industry? So basically, students, the steam engines ran the spinning machines, doing the work of the hundreds of women. अब क्या हुआ, जो ये व्हील था, इसको अल्टीमेटली जब स्पिनिंग जेनी भी बनी थी तो घुमा तो एक औरत ही रही थी, लेकिन जैसे ही स्टीम मशीन आई, स्टीम मशीन को उस व्हील से कनेक्ट कर दिया. मान लीजिए 10 स्पिनिंग मशीन रख दी, उन 10 के जो व्हील्स हैं उनको स्टीम मशीन से कनेक्ट कर दिया. अब वो अपने आप घूम रहे हैं, अपने आप घूम रहे हैं, यानी कि 10 मशीन एक स्टीम इंजन से चल रही है, तो और ज्यादा प्रोडक्शन हो गया. जितना ज्यादा प्रोडक्शन होगा, कॉस्ट उतनी ज्यादा नीचे चली जाएगी, सस्ते कपड़े होंगे जिनको लोग खरीदना ज्यादा पसंद करेंगे. So you can see how these technological innovations impacted the textile industry, particularly in England. You have to remember when were these particular technological innovations done, who invented them, and the years. Okay. Now, students, herein there is one more important point. Herein you need to know that the Indian textiles continued to dominate the world trade till the end of 18th century. So basically, it was not that once the spinning jenny or the steam engine was created, quickly the England was able to cover the entire textile market of India. It took them some time, that is till the 18th century, probably 20-30 years. But after that, somehow during the beginning of the 19th century, England was successful in capturing the market of Indian textiles as well. So that is why, students, now we are going to talk about the next segment of Indian textiles, that is the decline in the Indian textiles. Now, what were the reasons? We have already talked about them, but now we are going to talk about them in definite pointers. So students, as I've already told you, with the development of cotton industries in Britain, Indian textile now had to compete with them in the European, African, and American markets. This was one reason. The second reason was that exporting textiles to England became increasingly difficult because of the high duties that were imposed on Indian textiles by Britain. तो दो कारण रहे, दो मेजर कारण ये रहे कि इंग्लैंड के अंदर बहुत ही फुर्ती से प्रोडक्शन बढ़ रहा था टेक्नोलॉजिकल इनोवेशंस होने की वजह से, जिसकी वजह से इंडिया का जो यूरोप में, अमेरिका में मार्केट था वो खत्म होने लग गया. और दूसरा रीजन जो हमने कैलिको एक्ट से भी समझा है वो ये था कि जो ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट थी वो इंडिया के क्लॉथ को या तो बैन कर रही थी या उसके ऊपर इतना ज्यादा इंपोर्ट ड्यूटी लगा रही थी कि जब वो इंग्लैंड में लैंड कर रहा था उसकी प्राइस इतनी ज्यादा हो गई थी कि नॉर्मल लोग उसे अफोर्ड नहीं कर पा रहे थे. एंड दैट इज व्हाई द मार्केट of Indian textiles, particularly the international market of Indian textiles, began to decline. Now, students, we are going to talk about the reasons because of which the domestic textile market of India declined. Now, the domestic textile market of India declined after the coming of the British East India Company. That is something which I believe you all know. Okay, before that, until there were Mughals, there were regional powers, they were all supporting the textile industry. However, the sole purpose of East India Company to come to India was to capture its entire trade and to ruin the domestic industry so that they can get all the profit. And that is why, students, the first strategic step that the Britishers took when coming to India was to capture the entire textile industry, because of which the domestic markets were absolutely shattered. Now, students, herein, by the 1830s, the British cotton cloth had flooded the Indian markets, leaving thousands of Indian weavers jobless. As I've already told you, by the 1830s, you can see already 30-40 years of the technological innovations have passed, because of which the production in England is superior, the cloth quality is cheap, and that is why they are flooding the entire domestic market of India with their cheap cloth, which is more affordable even for the Indian population, and that is why they are declining their own domestic people and buying the English cloth. So this was one of the reasons for the downfall of the domestic textile market in our country. Next, students, next important reason was that, so this was the main important reason. However, students, herein it will be important to note that the handloom weaving did not completely die in our country. So we know that India is famous for certain intricate carvings that needs the hand of a human, something that machine cannot replicate. And that is why the handloom weaving, particularly in our country, did not die, because these things could not be made by machines. Okay, so till here we have understood how the Britishers purposely destroyed the international and the domestic textile market of our country between the time period of late 18th century to the beginning of 19th century. Now, students, herein I would like to tell you one very important point, that is, once you will read these particular points in your textbook, there is a box in which this particular term is given, and the term is known as orang. Now, why this term is important, students? Because in the prelims 2020, we had got one question wherein we were given 3 pairs and we had to identify whether the description is matching to the term. Here in students, the first term itself was orang, and the description given was that he or orang is the in charge of the treasury of state. However, students, this is an incorrect explanation, because the definition of orang is given in your class 7 chapter of 8th class NCERT. Here in students, by orang we mean a Persian term for a warehouse, a place where goods are collected before being sold, or it is also referred to a workshop. यानी कि औरंग एक पर्शियन टर्म है, इसका मतलब एक कारखाना या वर्कशॉप होता है, ना कि किसी ट्रेजरी का इंचार्ज होना। तो स्टूडेंट्स, यहाँ से हमें अगेन मैं आपको यही पॉइंट आउट करना चाहूंगी कि इमेजेस बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट हैं, इमेजेस का डिस्क्रिप्शन बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। बॉक्स के अंदर अगर कोई डेफिनेशन दी हुई है आप उसको जरूर पढ़ेंगे, और उसके अलावा अगर आपको कोई अच्छा मैप दिया हुआ है जिसमें कोई इंपॉर्टेंट ट्रेडिंग सेंटर्स लोकेटेड हैं या कोई इंपॉर्टेंट कम्युनिटीज की लोकेशन दी हुई है, तो वो हमारे लिए अगेन इंपॉर्टेंट है। इसीलिए ये सारी जो एक्स्ट्रा इंफॉर्मेशन एनसीईआरटी में होती है, इसको हमें बिल्कुल इग्नोर नहीं करना है। टेक्स्ट तो पढ़नी है चैप्टर की, लेकिन उसके अलावा ये एक्स्ट्रा इंफॉर्मेशन भी बहुत जरूरी है। So students, till now we had understood the entire trajectory of Indian textile industry before the coming of the Europeans and after the coming of the Europeans, particularly the English East India Company. Okay, now we are going to talk about the revival of Indian textiles. So naturally, even trade is sort of a vicious circle. Once it goes down, there is a time when it comes up. Okay, so there came a time in the Indian textile industry wherein there was revival of the Indian textiles, and the biggest spur to this was given by the national movement and the First World War. Now, before coming to that, I would like to tell you that there were 2 important centers, that is Sholapur in Western India and Madura in South India, who had emerged as new centers of weaving in the late 19th century. By late 19th century, we mean the time period somewhere between 1880s to 1890s. तो हमने देखा कि कैसे 1790 से 1850s तक तो डिक्लाइन हुआ हमारा मार्केट, क्योंकि ब्रिटिशर्स ने बहुत ज्यादा प्रोडक्शन शुरू कर दिया था, टेक्नोलॉजिकल इनोवेशन आ गए थे, उनकी खुद की कंट्री ने हमारा इंपोर्ट बैन कर दिया था और हमारी कंट्री में सस्ते कपड़े ला दिए थे। तो ये सारे कारण रहे कि हमारा टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री खराब हो गया। लेकिन 1890s के आसपास से हमने फिर स्पीड पकड़ी, ठीक है, और नए इंपॉर्टेंट सेंटर्स इंडिया के अंदर आए, जैसे कि शोलापुर इन वेस्टर्न इंडिया एंड मदुरा इन साउथ इंडिया। Now, students, I had told you 2 important points which gave a thrust to the Indian textile industry and gave them a kind of a revival. And under that, I had told you that the national movement was very important because it sort of valorized the Indian textiles. People were made aware that you should use your own domestic textiles and ban or boycott the imported cloth. Under that, students, during the national movement, Mahatma Gandhi had urged the people to boycott the imported textiles and use the hand-spun, hand-woven cloth. And because of this, khadi gradually became the symbol of nationalism, and the charkha came to represent India, which was put at the center of the tricolor flag of the Indian National Congress that was adopted in 1931. तो जैसे ही गांधी जी और पावर में आए और नेशनल मूवमेंट स्टार्ट हुआ, तो जो सबसे बड़ा चेंज हुआ, जो कि हमने स्वदेशी मूवमेंट में भी देखा है, जो पार्टीशन ऑफ बंगाल के बाद हुआ था, इन दोनों ही मूवमेंट्स के अंदर जो बात थी वो ये थी कि इंडियंस अवेयर हो गए थे कि ब्रिटिशर्स हमारे मार्केट को खराब कर रहे हैं, हमारी इकोनॉमी को खराब कर रहे हैं। इसीलिए उन्होंने उनका लाया हुआ कपड़े को बॉयकॉट करने का डिसीजन लिया, उनकी पाइल्स एंड पाइल्स लगा के उनको जला दिया और अपने देश का खादी कपड़ा पहनने का प्रण ले लिया। एंड दैट इज व्हाई स्टूडेंट्स, द चरखा बिकेम द अल्टीमेट सिंबल ऑफ नेशनलिज्म इन आवर कंट्री। इन फैक्ट, दिस पर्टिकुलर फ्लैग which was the flag of the Indian National Congress had adopted the charkha as its symbol, which is presented here, and this was adopted in 1931. अगेन यहाँ पे ये एक इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्ट है, आप इसको याद रखेंगे। Now students, let's move on to the another slide. Apart from the spur that was given by the national movement to the textile industry, there was also Indians who were business minded, who were industrialists, who had set foot again in the textile market of our country. Having said that, students, you must know that the first cotton mill in our country was set up in Bombay in 1854. तो अभी तक आप इतना तो समझ ही गए होंगे कि 1780 से लेके 1850 तक हमारा डिक्लाइन रहा। 1850 के बाद से इंडिया के टेक्सटाइल थोड़ा सा रिवाइवल होना धीरे धीरे शुरू हो गया और इसी की वजह से इंडिया में टेक्सटाइल की फैक्ट्रीज लगने लगी और जो पहली फैक्ट्री लगी थी वो बॉम्बे में लगी थी 1854 के अंदर। उसके अलावा स्टूडेंट्स, फ्रॉम द अर्ली 19th century, Bombay had grown as an important port for the export of raw cotton from England to China. Now, there was one important reason so as to why Bombay particularly became an important textile center. The reason was that, students, it was close to the vast tract of black soil of Western India, wherein the cotton was grown. So naturally, students, if any particular factory is located near to the source from where the raw material is being gained, then there is this principle of setting up any particular industry that you have to set up it in a particular area which is around the raw material. Now, since Bombay was very close to the tracts of black soil in Western India, that is why it became a very apt place to make the entire trade flourish, particularly with respect to the cotton textiles. Now, students, after the Bombay mill, next came the mill in Ahmedabad in 1861. And after that, in 1862, another mill was established in Kanpur in the United Provinces, which is now known as Uttar Pradesh. And also, students, the coming up of these particular factories gave employment to many, many artisans. Now, अभी तक मैंने आपको समझा दिया कि कैसे रिवाइवल हुआ, रिवाइवल के क्या कारण थे, कारण के अंदर नेशनलिज्म हो गई, कारण के अंदर नई फैक्ट्रीज आनी हो गई। लेकिन स्टूडेंट्स, ये जो नई फैक्ट्रीज आई थी, इनके लिए काम करना इतना आसान नहीं था, क्योंकि हम ये नहीं भूल सकते कि 1850s के टाइम पे इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी हमारे देश से चली नहीं गई थी, बल्कि अपने आप को और स्ट्रांगली इस्टेब्लिश कर रही थी उस पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम पे। सो नेचुरली दे वर क्रिएटिंग हर्डल्स फॉर देम सो दैट द इंडियंस कुड नॉट सक्सीड इन द टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री. So what were the problems? The first problem was that the textile industries found it difficult to compete with the cheap textiles that were imported from Britain. This is something that we have been constantly repeating, that Britain was flooding the market of India with the cheap textiles, and because of this, the fine qualities of Indian textiles could not compete with such cheap varieties, particularly because Indians were also not very rich and they could not afford such expensive clothing. Apart from the students, in most of the countries, the government supported the industrialization by imposing heavy duties on import. However, in our country, the scenario was different. We were a slave country. We were subjects of Britain. We were not an independent country. And that is why the colonial government refused to give us such protection to the local industries. जैसे ब्रिटेन के अंदर इंपोर्ट पे बैन लगा दिया था इंडिया के टेक्सटाइल्स का, इंडिया के अंदर ऐसा कुछ नहीं होने वाला था। ऐसा इसलिए नहीं होने वाला था क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ कॉलोनियल गवर्नमेंट थी, हमारे यहाँ हमारे देश की गवर्नमेंट नहीं थी, और कॉलोनियल्स तो चाहते ही थे कि इंडिया का मार्केट खराब हो जाए तो वो हमारा सामान खरीदे तो हम और पैसे कमा सके, एंड दैट इज व्हाई सच काइंड ऑफ प्रोटेक्शन वाज नॉट गिवन टू द इंडियन टेक्सटाइल्स. So these were the two problems that were faced by the new mills that were coming in our country, that is the cheap textiles from Britain and no protection from the colonial government. Now, students, I had told you in the last slide also that apart from nationalism, there was one important factor that gave a push to the Indian textile in the market again, and that was the First World War. Now, First World War is very, very important for us students. Why? Because India kind of got a boost with respect to its trading sector during the First World War. Now, Britain was very dearly interested in getting involved in the First World War, and they were fighting as a part of this particular war. And because they were fighting, most of the resources of their own country were used in the war. And that is why, to cover up their further needs, they had turned to India, that we need more supplies, whether it is iron, whether it is steel, whether it is textile. So they were asking the Indians to produce more goods for them. And that is why we got bulk orders, and that is why our industry sort of revived. So students, during the First World War, the textile imports from Britain declined and the Indian factories were called upon to produce cloth for military supplies. जैसा कि मैंने आपको अभी भी बताया, ब्रिटेन खुद इतना ज्यादा वॉर में इन्वॉल्व था कि उसकी कंट्री के डोमेस्टिक सप्लाईज यूज हो रहे थे, पूरे कंप्लीटली फिनिश हो रहे थे, इसलिए उसे इंडिया की हेल्प लेनी पड़ी. इंडिया के पास बल्क ऑर्डर्स आने लगे और ये जो नई नई मिल सेटअप हुई थी इनको बहुत बड़े बड़े ऑर्डर आने लगे, जिसकी वजह से ये प्रोग्रेस कर गई और ये बड़ी तरह से इंडिया में दोबारा इस्टेब्लिश हो गई। तो इसी को हम कहेंगे रिवाइवल ऑफ इंडियन टेक्सटाइल्स ड्यूरिंग द फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर। ऑलराइट, so students, till now we have completed the first segment of our particular chapter. That is the Indian textiles. Whatever entails as a part of the Indian textiles in this particular chapter has been discussed by me. I have told you all the points that are given in the NCERT. Even if you don't go back to the NCERT, this particular description is enough for you. You can solve many questions. So students, as I had told you, I am going to give you a quick 2-minute recap. I had told you that how the textile trade was there in India before the coming of British. That is, our textiles were very famous in the world. And then students, I had told you the origin of two terms, that is muslin and calico. All right. And then students, I had told you that what were the important varieties that were created in India, which were in demand internationally, such as chintz, coarses, bandana, etc. Also, students, I had again and again emphasized on the importance of the description of images. You have to go through them. All right. Then students, I had told you about the weaving community and the important weaving communities that were a part of India during the before the advent of the Europeans. Then students, we had understood the process of weaving, what was the role of men and what was the role of women, and what were the important instruments that were a part of weaving in our country. Next, students, I had told you the impact of the coming of East India Company on Indian textiles in our country, on the international as well as the domestic market. Now, students, when we talk about the international market, I had told you very specifically about the Calico Act and how the Britishers were not happy by importing the Indian textiles in their own country. And students, because they wanted to fight with the Indian textiles in the global market, they made certain technological innovations during the Industrial Revolution, which kind of gave an amazing boost to the textile industry of England. These technological innovations included the spinning jenny and the steam engine. उसके अलावा स्टूडेंट्स, वी हैड अंडरस्टूड कि इंडिया में जो डिक्लाइन हुआ इंडियन टेक्सटाइल्स का वो कैसे हुआ. हमने बोथ ये समझा कि इंटरनेशनल मार्केट का कैसे डिक्लाइन हुआ और डोमेस्टिक मार्केट का कैसे डिक्लाइन हुआ. उसके अलावा आई हैड टोल्ड यू दिस वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टर्म, दैट इज औरंग, व्हिच इज गिवन इन अ बॉक्स. दिस इज इंपॉर्टेंट बिकॉज इट वाज आस्क्ड इन द यूपीएससी प्रीलिम्स 2020 and this in turn tells us that why the NCERTs are so important. Now students, apart from that, I had told you about certain centers that became the revival centers of Indian textiles, such as the Sholapur and the Madura. And then students, I had told you the role of nationalism in respect to giving a boost to the Indian textiles once again. After that, students, I had told you the coming of the factories in our country, particularly in the textile sector, wherein the first mill was set up in Bombay in 1854, and then further many other factories came up. Finally, students, we had understood that what were the problems that were faced by the new mills and how the First World War gave a boost to the Indian textiles, again in the domestic as well as the international market. So students, with this, we have completed our discussion on the textile industry of our country. Now we are going to move forward to the second part of this particular chapter, that is the iron and steel industry. अब आयरन और स्टील इंडस्ट्री को समझाने के लिए इस चैप्टर के अंदर हमारे को एनसीईआरटी ने एक बहुत ही अच्छा एग्जाम्पल दिया है. वो एग्जाम्पल है टीपू सुल्तान की लेजेंडरी स्वॉर्ड्स का. टीपू सुल्तान के बारे में आप सभी जानते होंगे. टीपू सुल्तान मैसूर के एक बहुत ही फेमस लीडर रहे हैं, एक बहुत ही फेमस रूलर रहे हैं, जिन्होंने ब्रिटिशर्स के खिलाफ जंग लड़ी थी और अल्टीमेटली उनकी डेथ हो गई. So students, Tipu Sultan was very famous particularly because of his swords, which are now a part of the collection of museums in England, and they are considered to be very special. Now, what makes these slides so special, students? What makes these swords so special? It is because these swords are made from a special type of high carbon steel, which is known as woods. Yeah. So they are made from a very important type of steel, which is known as woods, and this was produced all over South India. अब यहाँ पे मैं आपको एक बहुत अच्छा एग्जाम्पल देना चाहूंगी स्टूडेंट्स. अगर आप सभी ने कभी गेम ऑफ थ्रोन्स देखा है, तो आपने देखा होगा कि जो भी उनके पास में swords होते थे, they used to say this is Valerian steel, this is Valerian steel. So whenever you see certain kind of names, let's say Valerian steel. So Valerian steel, I'm not saying that it was wood steel, but I'm telling you that there were certain steels, varieties of steels in the world, which were so famous because they were amazing in their quality. And woods was one of them. Woods was not only famous in India, it was famous all over the world. People all over the world used to come to India to buy wood steel. It was that amazing. All right. And that is why the swords of Tipu Sultan are considered to be quote unquote legendary. Now, these swords were also made in Western and Central Asia. And these steels, when made into sword, produced a sharp edge with a flowing water pattern. तो बेसिकली ऐसे अगर मान लीजिए ऐसी sword है, sorry for my drawing. Okay, so there was this flowing water pattern, and this was a result of the small carbon crystals that were embedded in the iron. अब इतनी डिटेल में हमें जाने की जरूरत नहीं है. जो पॉइंट है वो ये है कि इसके अंदर जो स्टील यूज होती थी वो बहुत अच्छी क्वालिटी की थी. बहुत अच्छी क्वालिटी की इसलिए थी क्योंकि उसके अंदर बहुत हाई कार्बन कंटेंट था. ओके, apart from the students, we have to remember that this was produced all over South India, and also it was also made in Western and Central Asia. तो आप समझ चुके हैं वुड स्टील की क्या इंपॉर्टेंस है. कार्बन, इसके अंदर बहुत अच्छा कार्बन कंटेंट होता है. साउथ इंडिया में बनती है, वेस्टर्न इंडिया में, वेस्ट और सेंट्रल एशिया में बनती है. टीपू सुल्तान की वुड स्टील से swords बनती थी जो कि बहुत ही फेमस थी. Now, students, we are going to talk about an important foreign traveler who had come to India particularly to study about the wood steel. Okay, so the name of this particular person was Francis Buchanan, and he had left an extensive account of the technique by which the wood steel were produced in many hundreds of the smelting furnaces in Mysore. So students, after the death of Tipu Sultan, this gentleman, that is Francis Buchanan, had come to our country, and he toured the entire state of Mysore and many parts of South India in order to understand the process of getting the wood steel made. And that is why he left a very important account which gives us good details pertaining to the composition of wood steel. And that is why the name of this particular person is going to be very, very important. We do get a lot of questions with respect to foreign travelers and the details that they have given with respect to our country. For instance, students, we had also got a question once of Tavernier, and Tavernier was a jeweler, a sort of a jeweler who had given a good account of the diamond industry in our country. Similarly, Francis Buchanan is giving us an account of the steel industry in our country, and that is why he's going to be important. Now, students, in your particular chapter, an important definition of the process of smelting is given. तो ये इसके डेफिनेशन है, आप रीड कर लेना. बेसिकली इसका पॉइंट ये है, स्मेल्टिंग का मतलब ये होता है कि जिस रॉक के अंदर जो मेटल होती है उसको गर्म करके उसमें से मेटल निकाल लेना और फिर उसको मोल्ड करके किसी भी चीज की शेप दे देना, चाहे वो बर्तन हो, चाहे वो सोड हो, एटसेट्रा. सो जस्ट हीटिंग द मेटल फ्रॉम इट्स ओरिजिनल ओर एंड मोल्डिंग इट इनटू अ सर्टेन शेप टू गेट एन ऑब्जेक्ट आउट ऑफ इट इज द प्रोसेस दैट इज आइडेंटिफाइड एज स्मेल्टिंग. ऑलराइट, नाउ स्मेल्टिंग इज डन इन सर्टेन फर्नेसेस. फर्नेसेस क्या होता है, ये फोटो देखिए आप. ये जो पिक्चर यहाँ पर दी हुई है इसके अंदर आप देखेंगे ये है. अब ये क्या होता है, इनके अंदर आग लगा रखी होती है इन्होंने, इसके अंदर आग लगी हुई है और ऊपर ये लोग मेटल, जो भी आपका मेटल ओर है उसको रख देते हैं, वो गर्म होता रहता है और फिर उसके अंदर से मेटल निकल जाता है. Okay, so these are the furnaces. Now, important for us here is that these furnaces were made of clay and sun-dried bricks. Now, this again is a very important statement. Statement-based questions आते हैं इस तरह की information के ऊपर. That in India, particularly in South India, what was the material that was used to make furnaces for smelting iron? So you have to remember that the furnaces were made of clay and they were made of sun-dried bricks. जैसे इंडस वैली सिविलाइजेशन में भी पूछ लेते हैं ना कि घर कैसे घर में कौन सी ब्रिक लगी हुई थी, सन-ड्राइड ब्रिक थी, क्ले थी, रेड ब्रिक थी, कौन सी ब्रिक लगी हुई थी. उसी तरह से जब भी कोई मटेरियल ऑफ कंस्ट्रक्शन का पॉइंट है आपको उसको याद रखना है. ओके, now students, the smelting was done by men while women worked at the bellows. Bellows क्या होता है? Bellow is a device or equipment that pumps the air. तो बेलोस रखे हुए होते हैं, उनमें से हवा निकलती है जो आग को थोड़ा सा उफान देती है, एंड ये काम औरतें करती थी. तो नाउ जस्ट लाइक द टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री जहां मैंने आपको समझाया था कि स्पिनिंग औरतें करती थी और वीविंग आदमी करते थे, सिमिलरली जब आयरन और स्टील बनती थी तो स्मेल्टिंग का काम आदमियों का होता था और बेलोइंग का काम वुमेन का होता था. इस सेग्रीगेशन को आपको याद रखना है, ये इंपॉर्टेंट होता है. All right, let's move on. So students, till now we have understood about the wood steel, its key components, the person who had left an important account on the wood steel, and what was the process of creating wood steel. Not the process of iron smelting in our country. Now students, we are going to talk about the famous, the extent of famousness that the wood steel had all over the world, and also the origin of the term woods. So students, basically woods is an anglicized version of the Kannada word ukku, Telugu word hukku, and the Tamil and Malayalam word urukku, which all correspond to the term steel. Okay, so basically it's an anglicized version of all these terms. Apart from the students, as I had already told you, I have also given you the example of Game of Thrones. Okay, this was very, very famous. Wood steel was very famous all over the world, and it fascinated many, many European scientists in a manner wherein a very legendary scientist, that is Michael Faraday. Who was Michael Faraday? He was the father of electricity and electromagnetism, the discoverer of the electricity and electromagnetism. He was one person who had spent years studying the properties of Indian woods. So you can understand how important or how famous this steel was. This was considered one of the finest all over the world. All right. Apart from the students, the wood steel making process is completely lost by the mid 19th century, that is by the 1850s. Why? Because our country was conquered by Britishers, and it was flooded with the imported iron and steel from England, which displaced the Indian steel making process. अब स्टूडेंट्स, हमने अभी तक वुड स्टील के बारे में पढ़ा. वुड स्टील क्या थी, कितनी इंपॉर्टेंट थी, क्या अच्छी बातें थी उसकी, क्यों वो फेमस थी, कौन कौन लोगों ने उसके बारे में पढ़ा है या उसके बारे में अकाउंट्स दिए हैं. ये सारी बातें हमने वुड स्टील के बारे में समझ ली. Now students, we are going to understand that what led to the decline of wood steel, and in particular the decline of the iron and steel industry in our country. कारण क्या हो सकता है? एक ही कारण है, ब्रिटिशर्स. वो आए और उन्होंने हमारी कंट्री के अंदर ट्रेडिंग पर्सपेक्टिव से आए थे, तो उन्हें सब चीज बर्बाद करनी थी. सब चीज बर्बाद करने में ऑब्वियसली इंडस्ट्रीज तो आती हैं. तो जैसे ही वो इंडिया आए, उन्होंने इंडिया के मार्केट को अपनी आयरन और स्टील से फ्लड कर दिया. एंड बिकॉज ऑफ दैट, बिकॉज ऑफ द चीप इंपोर्ट्स दैट वर डन एज अ रिप्लेसमेंट ऑफ द इंडियन आयरन एंड स्टील, पीपल टेंड टू बाय दैट, एंड दैट इज व्हाई आवर आयरन एंड स्टील इंडस्ट्री बिगैन टू डिक्लाइन. ऑलराइट. Apart from the students, there was another important reason which led to the decline of the iron industry in our country, and that is the forest laws that were put forward by the British government or the East India Company. अभी forest laws क्या है? So basically इसी book का जो पिछला वाला part है, that is part 1, उसमें एक chapter है tribals and decos. So therein a good explanation of forest laws is given. However, I'm going to tell you what these forest laws were. So once the Britishers came to India, they came to know about the vast resources that were captured as a part of forests in our country. So what they started doing is that they started designating certain areas of forest as reserved forest, meaning that nobody can enter these forests. Now we know that our country is covered with many, many tribes whose primary occupation is pertaining to the hunting and gathering or collecting the forest produce, and that is how they live their entire life. Their subsistence is absolutely based on forest. And once these forest laws were put forward, there was absolute restriction on entering forests by Indians. All right. And this was one of the biggest reasons why the people could not collect raw material, and gradually our iron and steel industry began to decline. So students, the new forest laws prevented people from entering the reserved forest. Reserved, I've already told you, they were reserved. That is, nobody can enter these areas except the British people with authorization. And this destroyed the supply of wood for burning charcoal and mainly the collection of iron ore. अब आयरन ओर तो जंगल में ही होता है. अब जंगल में जाने ही नहीं दे रहे, तो कैसे हम आयरन लेके आएंगे बाहर? अब हम तो ला नहीं सकते. ला कौन सकता है? ब्रिटिशर्स ला सकते हैं. तो नेचुरली उनकी इंडस्ट्री को तो वापस ग्रोथ मिल गया, और हमारी जो डोमेस्टिक इंडस्ट्री थी वो डिक्लाइन हो गई. Apart from the students, in some of the areas, government did grant access to the forest. However, the tax that was to be paid by the iron smelters to the forest department was so high that it ultimately reduced their income. उनको इतना ज्यादा टैक्स देना पड़ जाता था कि जो अल्टीमेटली उन्होंने प्रोडक्ट बनाया उसको वो इतनी हाई प्राइस पे बेच भी नहीं सकते, तो वो नो प्रॉफिट नो लॉस की जगह लॉस में ही चले जाते थे आधे से ज्यादा टाइम. एंड दैट इज व्हाई दे जस्ट कंप्लीटली लेफ्ट ऑफ फ्रॉम दिस पर्टिकुलर प्रोफेशन. Also, students, as I had already told you in the previous slide, there was immense import of iron and steel from Britain, which lowered the demand of the Indian iron and steel in our own country. So till now, students, we had understood the properties of wood steel. Then we had understood the reasons for the decline of iron and steel industry in our country. That is the immense imports from Britain, and also the forcing of forest laws in our country. So till now we have understood this. Now students, we are going to talk about the aspect of revival. पूरा चैप्टर इस तरह से है कि पहले कितना अच्छा था, ब्रिटिशर्स के आने पे कैसे खराब हुआ और फिर कैसे रिवाइव हुआ. दोनों ही जो वीविंग है और जो आयरन है, दोनों ही इसी ट्रेजेक्टरी से चल रहे हैं. Now students, now we are going to talk about the coming of iron and steel factories in our country. Under that, the story goes that there was this American geologist whose name is Charles Weld. And then there was Dorabji Tata, of course, who was the eldest son of Jamshedji Tata. And they had set out to Chhattisgarh in 1904 in search of pure iron ore deposits. Now, students, you all must be knowing that Chhattisgarh is very rich in their iron ore deposits. And that is why the eldest son of Jamshedji Tata, that is Dorabji Tata, with his American friend, went to Chhattisgarh to find these deposits. Now, students, in this particular quest, they were helped by the locals named Agarias in the discovery of the source of iron ore, and this later became a supplying method for the Bhilai steel plant. तो भिलाई स्टील प्लांट तो बहुत बाद में आया है, अराउंड 1955 में आया है, बहुत टाइम बाद आया है, बट पहले इनकी एक कम्युनिटी ने हेल्प करी थी जिनका नाम था अगरियास. अब जैसे ही ऐसी कोई आपको टर्म पढ़ने में आ जाए, एकदम कान खड़े हो जाने चाहिए. इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट आ गया, इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट आ गया. चैप्टर में आसपास देखो कोई ना कोई फोटो होगी जो इनके बारे में कुछ बता ही रही होगी. So students, this particular term corresponds to figure 13 in your particular chapter, wherein the picture is showing a village in central India, that is Chhattisgarh, where Agarias, a community of iron smelters, lived. तो इस एक लाइन से हमें एक बहुत अच्छा डिस्क्रिप्शन मिल गया. एक कम्युनिटी थी, उनका नाम था अगारियास. They were very famous iron smelters and they used to live in Chhattisgarh. ठीक है, जब भी ऐसी कोई कम्युनिटी का नाम आएगा आपको उसको जरूर जरूर याद रखना है. आर्ट एंड कल्चर के पर्सपेक्टिव से भी इंपॉर्टेंट है और मॉडर्न इंडियन हिस्ट्री में तो इंपॉर्टेंट है. Now students, apart from this, it will be important to note that Jamshedpur was set up on the banks of the river Subarnekha after some years of the discovery of iron ore deposits. And finally, the Tata Iron and Steel Company began producing steel in 1912. तो आप देखेंगे कि कैसे जमशेदजी टाटा ने एकदम मन बना लिया था कि मैं एकदम बढ़िया आयरन ओर डिपॉजिट्स ढूंढूंगा, और इसी को कल्मिनेट करते करते इंडिया के अंदर टाटास के द्वारा एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट आयरन और स्टील की कंपनी बना दी गई 1912 में, जिसका शॉर्ट फॉर्म है टिस्को. ऑलराइट, सो नाउ वी हैव अंडरस्टूड हाउ the iron and steel industry in our country gradually started to revive. Now students, it will be important to note here that like the handicraft industry, the First World War again was very important in playing an amazing role with respect to the revival of iron and steel industry. How? Herein, it will be important to note that till the late 19th century, that is till the 1880s to 1890s, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain, and it was mainly done for the expansion of railways. However, during the First World War, the steel produced in Britain had to meet the demands of the war, and that is why Indian Railways turned to Tisco for the supply of rails. Also, students, the Tisco was responsible for producing shells and carriage wheels for the war. And as a resultant, by 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by Tisco. अभी यहाँ पर भी सेम ही ट्रैजेक्टरी हुई जो टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री में हुई थी. ट्रैजेक्टरी सेम यही है कि फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर आने की वजह से ब्रिटेन अपनी डोमेस्टिक नीड्स और वॉर की नीड्स को पूरा करने में लग गया, और इसीलिए उसने इंडिया पे ध्यान देना बंद कर दिया. ठीक है, एंड ये हो गया इस वजह से जो इंडिया के अंदर प्रोडक्शन हो रहा था, अब उसकी डिमांड हो गई. स्टील इंडस्ट्री के साथ पर्टिकुलरली ये हुआ कि ब्रिटेन का जो स्टील आ रहा था वो इंडिया के रेलवेज जो कि बहुत ही एक्सटेंसिवली बन रही थी उनमें लग रहा था, लेकिन वॉर की वजह से वो डिमांड शिफ्ट हो गई, और इसीलिए टिस्को की तरफ गवर्नमेंट बढ़ी कि अब आप रेलवे के लिए स्टील बना कर दीजिए. और धीरे धीरे उनका प्रोडक्शन इतना बढ़ा कि वो वॉर के लिए कैरेज व्हील्स भी बनाने लगे, शेल्स भी बनाने लगे, और ओवरऑल उनकी बहुत ज्यादा प्रोग्रेस हो गई. तो यहाँ पर आप देखेंगे स्टूडेंट्स की इसमें स्टील और आयरन की इंडस्ट्री में भी फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर का बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट रोल है, जैसे कि हैंडीक्राफ्ट इंडस्ट्री में रहा है. All right. So students, with this, we have completed our discussion. Now I'm going to give you a quick recap of the iron and steel industry as well. हमने सबसे पहले स्टार्ट किया था टीपू सुल्तान की सोर्ड्स के बारे में बात करना कि टीपू सुल्तान की सोर्ड्स इतनी फेमस क्यों थी, क्योंकि वो वुड स्टील से बनी हुई थी जो कि साउथ इंडिया में बनती थी पर्टिकुलरली, और ये बहुत अच्छी इसलिए थी क्योंकि इसमें हाई कार्बन स्टील कंटेंट था जो कि बहुत अच्छा हुआ करता था. देन स्टूडेंट्स वी हैड अंडरस्टूड कि वुड स्टील इतनी ज्यादा फेमस थी कि कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट लोगों ने उसके ऊपर अकाउंट्स भी लिखे हैं, जिसमें कि इंपॉर्टेंट अकाउंट था फ्रांसिस बुकानन का. ऑल्सो स्टूडेंट्स वी हैड अंडरस्टूड कि एक बहुत ही फेमस साइंटिस्ट थे माइकल फैराडे, जिन्होंने भी वुड स्टील के ऊपर काफी सालों तक रिसर्च की है. देन स्टूडेंट्स हमने समझा था कि इंडिया की आयरन और स्टील इंडस्ट्री कैसे डिक्लाइन हुई, जिसमें हमने ये समझा था कि ब्रिटेन से बहुत ज्यादा इंपोर्ट आ रहे थे, इसकी वजह से हमारा डोमेस्टिक सेक्टर खराब हो गया. और दूसरी प्रॉब्लम थी फॉरेस्ट लॉस, जिसकी वजह से इंडियंस और ट्राइबल्स को फॉरेस्ट के अंदर घुसने से मना कर दिया गया था. अगर घुसने भी देते थे तो इतना ज्यादा टैक्स ले लेते थे कि जो फाइनल आउटपुट हम बनाते थे आयरन या स्टील का, वो बहुत ही महंगा पड़ता था और ओवरऑल लॉस में चले जाते थे. देन स्टूडेंट्स वी हैड अंडरस्टूड कि रिवाइवल कैसे हुआ दोबारा. रिवाइवल में हमने समझा कि कैसे टिस्को बना, कैसे जमशेदपुर बना, और यहीं पे हमने एक नई कम्युनिटी के बारे में भी पढ़ा, अगरिया कम्युनिटी, जो कि बहुत फेमस थे एज एन आयरन स्मेल्टर इन छत्तीसगढ़. Finally, students, we had understood that what was the impact of First World War on the steel and iron industry in our country and how it gave a boost to the production of iron and steel in our own country, and particularly the rise of TISCO in India. So students, with this, we have completed our discussion on this particular lecture. Now I'm going to give you, we are going to solve these two practice MCQs. Before that, I would like to see what questions you have been asking. All right. Ma'am, are you going to continue these lectures? Okay, Shrutha, first of all, hi, and thank you so much for joining us. So every week I will be coming up with 2 lectures. They are not particularly on NCERTs, but they will be all value-added material for your UPSC preparation. This particular lecture is to introduce you to our NCERT module. It is a paid module and it will cover all the 6 to 12 NCERTs of all subjects, and they will be particularly taught in a manner which are important from UPSC perspective. So do subscribe to this particular module. All right. Ma'am, shall I, Vivek is asking, ma'am, shall I make notes of this lecture or detailed notes of Scholar is sufficient? All right, Vivek, in this particular chapter or in this particular module, I would like to tell you, when we are making the PPTs for you, we are using the exact language or the exact content that is given in NCERT. We are not producing or cutting any content on our own. The idea is to make a comprehensive video for you guys so that you can just look at this particular video, understand what are the important aspects of this particular chapter, and then move on to the next chapter so that you don't have to waste your time again to go back to NCERTs. So yes, this is very comprehensive. Also, you have slides in front of you. You can take a screenshot or you can make notes. That is up to you. All right, no more questions. So now students, we are on the last part of this particular lecture. Now we are going to attempt 2 practice questions based on the discussion which we have just done. Under that, students, the first question contains 3 statements and we need to identify that which among them are correct. Now students, the first statement says that the first cotton mill in India was set up in Ahmedabad. Now students, as we all know, this is going to be an incorrect statement because, let me go back to that slide. I had just told you that the first cotton mill in our country was set up in Bombay in 1854 and the next mill in India was set up in Ahmedabad in 1861. So Ahmedabad is not the first mill, it is the second mill. The first mill was set up in Bombay. Hence, this particular statement is incorrect. Now students, the second statement says that spinning jenny was invented by John Kye. This is going to be a correct statement, students, because it was indeed invented by John Kye. Now students, the third statement says that the Calico Act was passed in England to ban the use of printed cotton cloth. This again is going to be a correct statement, students, because मैंने आपको बताया था कि Calico Act ब्रिटेन के अंदर पास की गई थी. ये एक लेजिस्लेशन था जिसके द्वारा जो कॉटन क्लॉथ इंडिया से आ रहा था उसको बैन कर दिया गया था, जिससे कि इंग्लैंड का डोमेस्टिक मार्केट, टेक्सटाइल मार्केट सेफ रहे इंडिया से कंपटीशन के चलते. ऑलराइट, so we can see that only the second and third statement here are correct. and therefore our final answer for this particular question will be option B. अब स्टूडेंट्स ये पर्टिकुलर सैंपल्स जो है आपको, इनसे आपको समझ में आएगा कि यूपीएससी स्टेटमेंट बेस्ड क्वेश्चन ज्यादा बनाता है और इन्हीं तरह के स्टेटमेंट्स आपको घूम फिर के मिलेंगे। क्वेश्चन पैटर्न बिल्कुल ऐसा ही होता है, तो इनको देख के आप अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं कि चैप्टर के अंदर और क्या चीजें हैं जो स्टेटमेंट बेस्ड आ सकती हैं। ऑलराइट, एंड दैट इज द आइडिया ऑफ दिस प्रैक्टिस एमसीक्यूज फॉर यू गाइस। Now, students, the next question is asking us that which of these following travelers had left a detailed account on the wood steel production in India? बहुत ही आसान सा सवाल है, आसान इसलिए क्योंकि हमने पढ़ रखा है, अगर यूपीएससी में एकदम से आ गए तो आप कंफ्यूज हो जाएंगे। इसका आंसर है फ्रांसिस बुकानन। मैंने आपको अभी अभी बताया था दैट फ्रांसिस बुकानन वाज वन पर्सन हु हैड केम टू इंडिया आफ्टर द डेथ ऑफ टीपू सुल्तान एंड ही एक्सटेंसिवली ट्रैवल्ड साउथ इंडिया and wrote a detailed account on the techniques and production of wood steel in our country, and that is why this particular personality is important. And therefore, students, our final answer for this particular question is going to be option C. So students, with this, I have completed the discussion on this particular lecture. The idea of this video was to show you what we are entailing in the NCERT course, how elaborate it is, and how you will benefit from it. We are constantly going to tell you and differentiate between what is important for UPSC, what is not important for UPSC. We are going to help you through the MCQs as well. Now, students, I would like to take more questions from you. Please, if you're there, do ask many questions. All right, I guess this is it. Okay, students, I believe you don't have any more questions. It was very nice connecting with you all. Please go through this entire video. If you like our content, please like, share and share this video with all of your friends. Also, students, I would like you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are coming up with amazing content every week, and it is absolutely pertaining to your UPSC preparation. There is value-added material, there are teaching sessions, and you will be it'll be very beneficial for all of you. So do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. You will get all the updates whenever we are coming online. So students, with this, I am completing my video. Thank you so much.